Professor Sam Elkington. He needs very little introduction. I'm sure everyone knows him. But Sam is a professor of learning and teaching at Teesside University. He's a principal fellow of the WIHEA, and he's a 2021 National Teaching Fellow. And I think I met Sam a few years ago when he was the national lead for assessment and feedback at Advanced HE, and he has extensive experience in higher education, and I'm sure most of you have come across his fantastic work on inclusive assessment. For anyone that hasn't seen his book yet, his latest publication, 2021, Enhancing Learning Through Formative Assessment and Feedback. It's a fantastic book, so just take a look at that. So no pressure for you, Sam. I just want to mention before we start that we are recording the session. So if anyone doesn't want to have their camera on during the session, please feel free to switch it off. But it is going to be a very interactive session, and Sam has got a fabulous layout for the session for you today. So over to you, Sam.
Thanks very much, Letty. Appreciate that. Very uncomfortable introduction on a personal level. So it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks again for the invitation. I very much value the opportunity to talk and work with you today, and value the WIHEA offer in terms of the workshop series more broadly, having been part of them in the past. So yeah, we're going to do some work together today. If you think you're going to sit there in the sun and have a cup of tea and just listen to me talk for 2 hours, you've got another thing coming. I certainly shan't be doing that. So we're going to be working together on some bits and pieces around inclusive assessment, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what that looks like in a minute. But obviously, as Letty's just said there, I'm going to be drawing on ongoing work that I've been involved in the assessment space, both here at Teesside and externally as well, in various sector-wide projects. So part of this is about us tuning into what we know now, having been through what we've been through, but also to do some of that learning, apply some of that learning. And I'm going to provide you with some ideas, a loose framework to rethink and reframe inclusive assessment. We're going to see how we get on with all of that. Okay, so very, very excited to see where we go with this. And I was just kind of half joking with Letty and colleagues this morning that we're going to try some things out, as I always do in these things, and some things will work and some things won't, and the things that do work will surprise me, and it'll be great. So hopefully everybody's on board with trying a few things out this morning. So let me just get my slides up. And hopefully Teams having conveniently updated 3 minutes before coming online this morning, you can see that. Can everybody see that? Wonderful, we've got a thumbs up. So that's the first win of the day. So that's what we're here to do. That's me. You can find me on Twitter, and we're looking at what matters most in inclusive assessment. I think really for me that's a real driving question for the sector, a really key question for the sector right now. There's lots of great work being done in this space, and we're going to get into different ways of thinking and working with that. Certainly more kind of pragmatically in terms of how we package up our assessment, learning, and the teaching assessment, learning and teaching arrangements. Sorry, to be more inclusive. So structure for what is going to be very interactive workshop with you guys today. So what's the plan? The plan is, well, we've got a loose structure around 3 sections, but there's really 5 steps to the process. So the first step is, asking the question, so what do we know? What do we know about assessment? What do we know about inclusive assessment? We're then going to move into what is going to matter most. So trying to bring a bit of a future perspective to things. And we're all in this space at the moment where, certainly AI has got us thinking in those terms, haven't we? So what is going to matter most moving forward? And then what do we know now? So bringing some of the, the work that I've been involved in with colleagues here at Teesside, but also the wider projects I mentioned earlier on with the sector and other kind of research in the space. So what do we know now? What's the learning that we've done from that? Then there's going to be a time for pause. So we're going to kind of a mid-session pause for some questions and answers and some discussion around anything emergent at that point in time. And then we're going to get into trying to bring some of that, all of that learning to a reframing of inclusive assessment. I've got some activities there that hopefully will get us thinking and working slightly differently based on what we discussed previously. That's the plan, and it will shift and change, no doubt, but we'll go with it. So we will be making use of Padlet, and colleagues Michelle and Letty will be dropping the links to the various Padlet pages as and when we need them. There's already been one. If you scroll to the top of the chat there, you'll see seminar, Sam Elkington Q&A, please add your questions below. So you'll be able to link, if you open that, there's a couple of colleagues already checked the link and it does work. So what we're going to be doing is very much using that first Padlet there as like a running space for your questions. Okay, so you can use the chat, of course, but with so many people in the room, it's often very difficult to kind of manage that. So one way around that is to have a separate resource for you to drop your questions on. We'll be checking that throughout, but when we get to the time for a pause, both in the middle and at the end, we'll go back to that Padlet. We'll look at those questions and we'll try and work through as many as we can. It's also intended as a bit of an asynchronous resource, so we'll keep this live and open for maybe 6 or 7 days after today. I'm going to go back to it this time next week. Any questions in there that haven't been answered or responded to, I'll provide a response. And obviously, you already have access to the Padlet, but Letty and colleagues will reshare that, so you have an opportunity to look again at those. So do feel free to drop questions and comments on the Padlet. Obviously, you can use the chat space as well, but like I say, with so many of you, some of those questions might get lost. So the Padlet's a good way of just managing that. Hopefully that sounds okay. Everybody can access the chat and everybody can access the Padlet. And if everybody's okay and we've got some thumbs up, we can move on. Okay, so let's get started then. So this is just a very easy first move here to make. Okay, so we're going to ease into things. And this is a bit of interaction for you. So what matters most? We're here to talk about inclusive assessment. We're here to talk about more broadly about assessment, what it means moving forward, hopefully get some ideas around, what we're currently doing, how they stand up against what others are doing, but also where we might want to take assessment moving forward. But we need a line in the sand. We need a sense of where we're at right now. So what matters most is the question I ask probably most often in any kind of interaction with staff, whether it be here at Teesside or outside of Teesside, and it's just a good opening gambit in the sense of it gives me a sense of where you guys are at in terms of your thinking, how you're thinking and talking about assessment, but also it gives us a yardstick for the session that we can revisit later on. So using the chat space, what I want you to do is, and please use your powers of brevity in this, because we will end up with quite a bit. But I want you to think about this and list your top 3 features of effective assessment design in your subject field. We will have a mix of fields and disciplines in the room, and this is what makes this activity so useful. But it's really down to you. You're the authority on your own experience and expertise here. So for you, what are the top 3 features of effective assessment design in your subject field? I'm going to give you a few moments to think about that and to post your responses in the chat if you would be so good. Thank you. Okay, so Donna straight in there. Alignment, providing students with assessment information to improve and learn. Assessment reflects real world tasks. Lovely, thank you for that. Sophie, again, very quick. Constructively aligned, testing skills development, ChatGPT proof. Okay, we're going to get onto some of that. It's interesting. Letty, practice-based, well aligned to outcomes and reflective. No surprises there, Letty, nice work. Active, practical, relevant. Alignment making another appearance there. Assessment strategy, constructive alignment, authentic. Okay, so there's a clear strategy of assessment. Yeah, so Eleanor, really nice there in terms of spaces. Really like that. Going to get onto that later. Reflection on learning and embedded into tasks. So process focus, feedback making appearance there. Absolutely. Scaffolded to increase confidence and engagement. Love that. Cassie, really like that. Authenticity. Constructively aligned again. Good choice from Jim. Jim's not elaborating on that. He's just going that it just has to be choice. I love that. We're going to get into that as well around ideas of flexibility, formative and summative components. Yes, practical application, authentic, accessible, aligned and authentic from Eileen. Equitable, lovely. Okay, authentic, student-centered from Jen. Really like that, Jen. Nice work. Jessica, alignment, relevant, purposeful to practice. Love that. So there's a purpose, clear purpose to assessment. We're going to come on to that as well. Inclusive of various learning levels, which I like. I like that. Recognizing that, you know, one size doesn't fit all. Love that. And also, you know, all students aren't starting at the same point. But I'm assuming you mean in levels there in terms of levels of study as well. So that's equally important. Equity, comprehensibility and relevance from Tim. Love that. Some really nice, and also I think what's really useful when you do these types of activities, or certainly this one, is you start to see some themes, don't you? So there's some themes here around authenticity, alignment, you know, a clear structure and plan for assessment. I mean, Joe's gone all out and complete maverick here and said it should be enjoyable. I mean, no, absolutely not. It should not be enjoyable, of course. Apologies, I'm a bit jaded from my year 6, my son in year 6 who's just gone through SATs, and enjoyment was very much last on the list, I think. So don't get me started on that one, but you might hear me wax lyrical about that at some point and get on my high horse. Student choice, love that from Jim. So choice is another theme here. Clear, unambiguous guidance about how to achieve the best grade. Okay, yeah. You know, so what are we doing here? Why are we doing it? How do we do it well? Practical skills, embeddedness from Rosa there. Varied, lovely work. Okay, some really nice language, some really nice points well made, and some clear themes, I think, that we'll be revisiting throughout the conversation we have today. And of course, nothing wrong there. These are all absolutely as they should be. But I think what we see is there's a whole variety of different features in and around effective assessment. I think clearly what would matter is what we're trying to do. You know, so those, again, that purpose is clear. So creativity has made an appearance from Claire. So enjoyment and creativity coming through, which I find really interesting. Again, nobody would disagree with that. How do we do that? How do we do that well? And how do we do that in a legitimate way within the systems that we operate? Or do we need to change systems completely? Another question for another time. Okay, what this is really about is, what do we value? What do we value most in our assessment? It's a values-based exercise. And it's an exercise or a question we don't ask ourselves very often. We might ask ourselves it on an individual level. We might feel it, but is it intentionally part of our, you know, assessment and learning and teaching design conversations? And I think it really does change the conversation when you start here. And just to give you a hypothetical situation here to mull over as we work things through. I mean, we would be a very large program team at 67 plus individuals, but imagine that we were here today as a program team and we were talking about what matters most. What this demonstrates is, if we don't have that conversation up front, if we don't have a dialogue around what matters most and have a clear sense of how that plays out in practice, what we end up with is clearly everybody having similar but slightly different, and in some cases very different, views on what matters most. And if that's left unchecked or monitored or isn't factored into our designs and our conversations around assessment practice, then we run the risk of operationalizing a very diffuse, fragmented assessment offer to our students, and we often see that played out in in poor NSS results. Certainly in the qualitative comments that I've seen in my time, you know, it's almost always around lack of transparency, inconsistency of practice, or just not knowing really what they should, that was needed of them in terms of their expectations. So this is a really important question to ask, and something that I continuously ask our colleagues here at Teesside. And we have a yardstick now from which to work, and we're going to come back to this. But I want you to hold these, you know, the ideas that we've shared here in your head, in your minds, in your heads as we work through today. And we might revisit this and ask ourselves what matters again and see if anything's changed. So that's what matters most, and that's for you, and actually it's for me, because it gives me a sense of how you're thinking and working in the assessment space. And it's something else I'm continuously asking myself and others is, okay, but what do we know? What do we know about assessment now? We know what matters, but what do we know about that in practice terms? And we've had a lot go on, have we not, in the last 3 to 4 years, in terms of, pandemics and, rapid hybrid delivery and new models of learning and teaching, and lots and lots and lots of change, kind of wider socially and societally. And it's certainly been a time and a requirement to rethink assessment and feedback. I think that's been pretty clear and evident. And we've all been in that space. We've all had need and had, cause for pause, but also need to change. The degree to which those changes are sustained is something I think that we're still trying to work out. At what point are these things, have they fundamentally changed the way that we do assessment at university? From what I'm seeing and hearing, there is some change, but I think largely there's a reverting back to familiar practices that we know how they work. But has the learning really been done? What we've found, and this is me drawing on the work that I've been involved in, but also the literature as well, and all the various conversations that I had across the sector to various learned organizations, these are some of the key kind of themes or features that have emerged from this time of learning. So we've seen emerge, well, these are things that we've probably known about but not really thought about, I guess, but the high risk nature of many of our established assessment practices, so the high stakes summative nature of so much of what we do, when there was a need to flip that or to change that at speed, we found that actually this is high risk. There's a lot of that high risk work still playing out, and is that really beneficial for student learning development, which at bottom is the ball game. A lack of relevance to future students' future lives, so that a lack of future perspective, very much a task focused enterprise assessment, and not really something that is, or we might hold it in our heads and how we talk about assessment, but in terms of the doing of it, is there a future relevance to what students are going to be doing, not just over the course of their program, but actually when they leave us and then to the world of work? Can they see that play out in what we have them do in assessment? And that was clear. A limited range of assessment types and formats. This is something I think this dates back all the way back to Tansy Jessup's work around Tester in 2014, when she would, I think there was a line in that work, the published work there, which in the thousands of courses that they'd engaged with and staff that they'd engaged with, they'd whittle it down to it was something in the region of 100% of the assessments that they'd seen, were made up of 10 different types of assessment. And I think that's a really interesting ratio when you think of just the diversity of courses and practice and everything else, just the creativity in the academy, that we're still limited in terms of what we do in the assessment space in terms of the format. So I think we're seeing some change in that, certainly post-pandemic, and looking at the affordance of the hybrid delivery, but actually I think we're still very limited in our imagination when it comes to assessment in that space. Feedback often an afterthought in assessment design. This is something that certainly through the book that Alistair Irons and myself put together, we were certainly seeing, and it was kind of a key driver and motivation for the book itself. But very much a task-driven thing, assessment. Feedback being seen almost as an additional task that comes next, as opposed to it being an integrated part of that whole kind of enterprise of assessment. So certainly during the pandemic, it was like, well, actually, we focus on the feedback. That brings a certain communicative element, and we're building relationships, we're having a dialogue, and we're actually understanding where students are. So actually, feedback played, if anything, a more important role. And that's something that was really interesting to work through. And obviously, more recently, we've got AI in learning, teaching, assessment. We're all grappling and wrestling with this right now. Yeah, realizing that, well, there's no getting ahead of it. And we've got to work with it, but how do we work with it? How we do that well? And again, there's no right or wrong answer to that. So in the assessment space, when we are making changes, and changes are potentially risky in terms of not working, how do we do that? And what do we need to be doing in that space to work alongside and with AI. And there are others, no doubt. There are others. Something I thought of just piecing this workshop together was, the challenge we have around student engagement in the sector right now. The role that assessment plays within that, in terms of giving them, that the effective dimension. We're going to come into that little later, and how assessment can drive active student engagement, both individually and collectively. But there are others, and I'm sure you have your own. But it is time to rethink assessment and feedback. There are so many reasons to do that, and I'm going to try and talk to and present some of the opportunities and work that will hopefully allow you to do the same. So what do we know now, having been through all of that and potentially had to rethink our practice in the assessment space and try new things out and run with alternative arrangements for assessment? Well, there's been some great work done in the inclusive assessment space, particularly. The implications of making these changes, these alternative arrangements for assessment and thinking about things through an inclusive lens is a real eye-opener. So we're making these changes, or we want to develop our assessments, but at what point do we apply the inclusive assessment lens? So is it at the end, or is it at the beginning? At what point in the conversation do we apply it? And so much of what's happened over the last 3 or 4 years have really called out what I've called, this isn't Yuso Naiman's term, this is my term, the mindlessness of assessment design. So mindless assessment design, I only like that because the acronym's MAD, so you can take that and run with it as much as you like. But we are mad if we continue to do the same things, even though in light of evidence that they're all better, more effective alternatives. So Yuso makes some great points in this particular piece of work, the link to which will be in the interactive resource, which is going to be shared with you later. He said assessments struggle to deal with the increasing diversity of students in higher education. We know that, but it's been exacerbated by recent events. In fact, assessments deemed so inaccessible that assessment accommodations are administered. So the fact that we have assessment accommodations at all, we have mitigating circumstances and other bits and pieces, suggests that at the point of design, assessment isn't terribly inclusive, because if it would be, we would have no need for those. So thinking about more broadly, this idea of inclusive assessment more broadly is absolutely imperative. It's a root of Yuso's work there. Another piece of work by Holden and colleagues, this is really pertinent in light of the AI kind of debate going on right now, is being the need, and there continues to be a need to be proactive around academic integrity. And ask the question, what are we modeling for here? When we talk about integrity, well, what is it that we're modeling for that's requiring us to design out, he says in inverted commas, collusion or cheating or whatever. So the prevention methods for academic dishonesty, says Holden colleagues, or cheating will always be limited in their success if we don't recognize students' needs and attitudes and how to address those in an inclusive way. So, we're approaching, or we have and continue to largely approach assessment in a very kind of what I would class as a performative paradigm of work, set of series and processes, and it's a QA driven thing as opposed to a quality enhancement or learning design driven thing. So what are we modeling for? We're modeling for secure systems. Well, yes, but if that's all they're modeling for, then we're always going to do our students a disservice. So a couple of pieces of work there I think you should really be spending some time with, and you'll have the links to those in due course. But just calling out some of the challenges that we're facing right now. And purpose has come up already this morning as a key kind of feature of assessment, and I don't think anybody disagree with that. And JISC's work here, I love this graphic because I use this all the time, because what it shows, yes, we need purposeful assessment. We need to do assessment on purpose, and by that I mean we need to think about that intentionally at the point of design. Not just well, I'll do this as a formative task and I'll do that and it will lead to the summative piece. Fine, you've given some thought to that, but what about the multiple purposes of assessment? And JISC's graphic here shows really nicely how these multiple purposes sit together in the context of practice. So we're all familiar with the assessment of learning. That's what largely associated with summative assessment. the institutional quality assured processes that lead to the qualification of student work. We're all dealing with that right now, right? We're dealing with the assessment of learning right now. 'Tis the season. Assessment for learning as learning. Again, we're going to be familiar with these things and these ideas. So the assessment for learning designs, emphasizing the formative opportunities, feedback, the feed forward, the learning in development, not just for now, but in the future. But then also the assessment as learning, the evaluative judgment, the active development of students as decision makers and evaluators and regulators of their own learning. Now, these all need to happen together, and they do in practice as they're lived, but how intentional are we in our design of bringing these out and really making them part of our assessment practices? So really, I really like the graphic, but also building on that, Margaret Bierman and colleagues have produced some work, which again, a must read. All the must reads are in the document I'm going to share with you, by the way, so don't panic that you won't be able to get access to them. All links are there, but Margaret Bierman calls for a movement away or beyond a task genre of assessment. So I mentioned earlier on that, we tend to be very task orientated in our assessment thinking, so we, and the adage of teaching to test or teaching to task, so what are we covering content wise that's going to then be brought through in terms of the assessment work that we're having our students do, instead of, when we're looking at this assessment on purpose kind of mentality, is okay, well, we need to design our assessments that are instead relevant to a unique time and place for the students right then, whether that be level 4, semester 2, or level 6, week 1, day 1, accounting for the challenges that we're setting at that moment in time, the skill level that those students have to meet those challenges, the settings and the circumstances. And we're going to come into later on how this work plays out as situated practice and something that we really need to pay attention to. So when I say assessment on purpose, it's the intentionality at which we're thinking about the different purposes of assessment, how they come together or hang together at the point of design, and not just as a task, but as a process. And we're going to come on to that again later. So really, in terms of what we know, we want our assessments to be purposeful, but that means certain things. And there's a certain level of intentionality that we need to make sure that we're applying. Something else that we know, and we only know really thanks to Jan MacArthur's fantastic work around rethinking authentic assessment, another must read. They're all must reads. But so Jan's work's been great in having us look again at the idea of authentic assessment and student involvement in that, and what it is in terms of the purpose that we're trying to achieve overall. So Jan talks about needing to appreciate and foster the role that assessment plays in developing students as both individual learners, but also individual humans, and their active and fulfilled lives beyond the university. So how can they enter into the world of work and broader society as active participants within that? So this kind of broadens this idea of authenticity, brings a more kind of ontological perspective onto it. And instead, what we need to do, says Jan, we need to have as a primary concern the person, person-centeredness, the person, the student, who becomes the reason for engaging in the assessment itself. And this is a really key point for me in the context of inclusive assessment, because what it actually does and I've not put this in the it just come in as I'm talking out loud here. This calls into play some work by Ron Barnett. We're looking probably 2013, 2009, 2013, 2011, something like that. Where he talks about not educating for skills and human skills, but actually human qualities. And that's really born out of this is a great book by Rola Ajari and colleagues, just come out around assessment as inclusion. And this whole book is a collection of edited work, and the whole book's about how you bring this to life in practice. And it's underpinned by an understanding that students as individuals are individuals, and as such have strengths and qualities and skills that are beneficial for their own learning, and we need to bring that out, and we need to draw that out, we need to value that in how we design and operationalize our assessments, but also for that of their peers as well. So actually recognizing that collective endeavor. So really great work, making us think again about not just what we do, but how we do it in assessment, and how we bring, as many people along with us as possible, and how we meet them where we need to meet them through our assessment designs and practices. So again, another thing around what we know. And something that I've spent quite a bit of time thinking about in assessment is this idea of flexibility in assessment. And I don't just mean, choice has come up already in the chat, and I would position choice within this, but it's not the only thing that we need to think about when it comes to flexibility. So for me, there's there's certainly been need for flexibility in terms of how we think and work with assessment in recent times. I think for me, flexibility moving forward in terms of the future perspective of assessment is now a non-negotiable. We have to think flexibly in terms of how our assessments not just are operationalized, but also lived out, and are shaped. So two underpinning dimensions for me here. We've got the flexibility from a practical improvement and effective performance perspective. So, flexible systems, flexible ways of working, the practical and technological drivers for flexibility around the different modes of accessing and delivering learning and teaching assessment that we find, the affordances of blended and hybrid delivery, for example, the embeddedness of digital tools and technologies, all the stuff that we're actively involved with now. But you've also got a second dimension which operates alongside that, and it's a focus on those human qualities, as I mentioned earlier on. A view of flexibility as an educational outcome in and of itself. So thinking about flexibility through assessment as ability for students to develop and demonstrate their ability to be flexible, to work differently, to think again, work again, change direction, and to be able to document that and understand that as a learning opportunity. So really emphasizing the ability of people to think, act, live, and work differently in complex, uncertain, and changeable societies and scenarios. Really plays into what Jan MacArthur was talking about a little bit earlier on about, being active and engaged citizens. So for me, flexibility is a broader term. It's not just about having a choice between A and B task in an assessment at one assessment point. It's actually a condition of design that has these two dimensions. And O'Neill and Padden have done some really interesting work here around, because it dovetails with the idea of diversification in assessment. So to be flexible, we also need to diversify how we do things. So pedagogically, flexibility in assessment provides students with a range of opportunities to take greater ownership and responsibility, authorship, if you will, for their learning, and engage in activities reflect their own learning needs. So where are they now? What do they need? How can we work with them on those in the context of the assessment task set to optimize the opportunities for learning? And so, greater flexibility goes hand in hand with greater diversification, which obviously brings its own challenges in terms of design and how we structure that from a process perspective. So these are all things that we know now that perhaps we knew a little bit about before, but actually because of what we've all gone through, the learning that's happened, and we're starting to see some of the evidence play out in the literature and the research now, these are really key considerations for me in the context of assessment design. Just to pause here, actually, before we move on to this, there's a comment I just want to pick up in the chat. So Claire says, super helpful, appreciate that. So often flexibility or flexible is bandied about as if it's self-evident without any shared understanding about what it should be or is. Couldn't agree more, and that's exactly the point. It's so much of assessment in terms of what we do is what we think with but not about. And that I'm talking there about the habits of practice. Okay, well, I'm doing this particular kind of work, I'm just going to lead to that kind of assessment task. Okay, but why? And are there alternative ways of doing that? Is there just one way of achieving that end, or are there multiple goals to multiple ends? And surely that's part of the conversation here. So I really like that, Claire, and I appreciate that comment. So that's kind of what we know, what we think matters most now, and what some of the things that we know from the learning that's gone on more recently in the inclusive assessment space. So you can see how some of those early ideas that you were sharing dovetail with some of that work's playing out, but also the need quite clearly to rethink quite a bit of what we do. No, not just in terms of what we do, but also how we do it. And that's going to be something I'm going to repeat all the way through the talk today. I'm very clear on that in terms of my attitude towards this is, yeah, what we do is fine, but actually what's going to define what comes out of this in terms of outcomes and everything else is how we do it. So it's not what you do, it's how you do it. So first activity, so this is where we're going to forcibly remove you and place you into random groups, which isn't terribly inclusive. So this whole exercise is done with a mass chunk of irony, but hopefully by bringing you together randomly, you're actually going to have better conversations. So you could argue, you know, the back end inclusivity and accessibility is there. He says, trying to dig himself out of a hole. So what is going to matter most is the next question we're going to ask ourselves. But I'm not going to ask this of you. You're going to do this yourselves. And we're going to go for about 10 minutes. So what's going to happen is you're going to be randomly assigned into groups. It's going to be largely equally distributed. And you're going to spend 10 minutes considering what is going to matter most moving forward. Now, this is part of that future perspective kind of exercise I said I wanted us to get into. So what are going to be the key features of effective assessment design in 2030? Now, you could leave 2030 out of it. I've done this a number of times now. And actually, by putting 2030 in, it gives you something to work towards. It's an event horizon that is just out of reach, but you can still see it. Yeah, so it's 1.5 TEF cycles away, for example. You know, if you're running, yeah, apologies, I know. So that's just for the audience. Or if you're launching a new 3-year undergraduate course this year, really it's 1.5 cycles through a new course. Or so actually, in terms of an event horizon, it's actually practically quite useful to think about. So what is going to matter most in terms of those key features of effective assessment design based on your thinking and reflections around what we've just discussed and the learning you've done? What I'm going to ask you to do is I'm going to ask you to work in your groups, consider that. Now, each of the Padlets will have, the Padlet will have this uploaded to it. So you'll be able to see the instructions within the Padlet. I'm going to ask somebody within the group the group can self-nominate, however, to be scribe and to record on the Padlet 3 to 5 key features that you've discussed around what you think is going to matter most. So each group will make one submission on the Padlet collectively. Okay, so rather than just kind of bombarding the Padlet with loads, and if you just want to put that as a list, that's absolutely fine. We'll come out after 10 minutes. We'll come back into this larger kind of collective group, and we'll share the Padlet. We'll go through some of the insight. So that's the idea. Okay, so this activity, 10 minutes in generation, probably another 10-15 minutes in terms of consideration, and then we'll move on. Does that sound okay with colleagues? Okay, so well, it's what we're doing, so you have no choice. Again, massively inclusive. Okay, so I'm gonna let the elves behind the scenes, and by elves I mean Michelle, to organise you into groups. We're going to go for 10 minutes, and then you'll be pulled out after 10 minutes, unceremoniously pulled out back into this. But if you can, within that time frame, please upload your 3 to 5 key features as a group. It would be much appreciated. It gives us something to speak to. Irene, you got your hand up, or was that in error? That was in error, I assume. No, it's absolutely fine. I just don't want any questions. Okay, any questions? Just pop them in the chat. So Eileen's, just to clarify, Eileen's made a good point in the chat. So we have the Q&A Padlet, which is also live, but that's just for questions as we go through. So if you've got any questions, more generally speaking, about what we're discussing here today, pop them in the Q&A Padlet. This is simply just for the task that we're running now around what is going to matter most. So just concentrate on that one for now. It's clearly titled, and this material is already in the Padlet. Okay, so Michelle, over to you.
Okay,
Organised folk.
Yep, sending everybody into the break rooms now. Okay.
Okay, so granted, not a great deal of time to work on what is a big question, but I'm just going to quickly share my screen, and hopefully, if Letty, you can just give me a yes, you can see that. Can you see that? Perfect. Thank you very much. Okay, so we've got most rooms in here now. represented. So let's have a look, and we can work through these, and if I will invite colleagues to elaborate if they feel like they are willing and able. So let's look through. So what is going to matter most? 2030 was our event horizon, but you could have picked any date, but 2030 was what we're working towards. So room 1 there, moving away from exams, introducing more reflective journals, continuous testing, more imaginative assessment. We were just talking about that in the main room, actually. So actually, you know, what room 1 there is suggesting, you know, a more process-driven emphasis. Will current assessments be I'm assuming that's archaic, or it could be arcade. By 2030, I'd say some of them are already archaic. We were just talking about the need perhaps for a countercultural movement. That's the only way that things are going to happen in this sector. Will there be more emphasis on research skills as opposed to knowledge retention assessment? Yeah, couldn't agree more. Practical examinations in disciplines like medicine, controlled condition exams, complete them to demonstrate skills. There are always going to need to be those scenarios. If you know, the whole scenario or hypothetical situation is, you know, if I'm going into a hospital and I need to have an operation, I want to know that my surgeon has done all the work needed and is held to the highest standards possible to do the best job in that operation. So that we are going to need to have certain types of practical examinations. Do they have to be timed? Do they have to have some of the, you know, the conditions that we put on certain exam conditions? You know, the whole timed nature of exams for me is just backwards. And again, biting my lip not to mention SATs. Focus on what is required for enjoyment. Exactly. The effective dimension, folks, just doesn't come into the conversation enough. What do you want to be doing with this task? What do you want to get out of this? What interests you? I want you to be able to demonstrate this kind of learning, but there's not one way of doing that. So what interests you best or most, and what do you want to pull through? What do you want to take with you? These are really important. So I like those suggestions. Really nice work from room 1 there. I'm going to go to the far left here. I'm not sure which room that was. But they mentioned effective use of AI in summative assessment, increased use of Viva type assessments. Absolutely, bring a more dialogic kind of model of assessment, I guess. Authenticity, developing skills that are relevant to the world of work. What does that look like in 2030? You know, we're already seeing that AI is changing industry now. You know, we're seeing, you know, BT getting rid of 40,000 staff because they can use a chatbot to operationalize the communication with service users in a more efficient manner. How's that going to change things more broadly? Our accountants here at Teesside, you know, the accountancy program teams here, well, actually, a lot of the technical stuff that we're having to do, AI is it's already able to do that. So what does it mean to be an accountant in the future? What skills are we going to need? Well, there's the question. You know, room 2, real life scenarios, ipsative assessment. Love that. So if you're not familiar with ipsative assessment, you know, the way I look at this, if you look at it through a sporting analogy, it's kind of a personal best approach to assessment. So building on what you've done before to improve your performance moving forward. So where was I when I did this last time? What did I need to do to improve? How can I do that through this task, and how have I achieved that? AI assistance for marking. Is that a question mark as in a plea? Because I think that is going to happen. It's already there. It's already there. You know, are we utilizing it as an affordance of the tools we have available? Probably not. We probably don't feel comfortable enough to use it, but it is certainly going to be there. It's already there. I'm going to give you some examples of that later. Room 4, linking the assessments to the learning outcomes, but ensure that the learning outcomes are dynamic enough to be creative, flexible assessment within the. Right, now we're into it. We were talking about this in the room. So what this requires is structural change and structural flexibility in terms of the QAA processes and, you know, everything else that goes on around it. So actually, you know, we do need a countercultural movement here if we're going to be, you know, the idea of being creative and flexible in assessment is something that we would all absolutely hang our colours to the mast on. You know, that'd be something we could absolutely get behind. But what are the inhibitors there? What are the enablers? But also, what are the inhibitors? Well, a lot of it's structural, process, policy. We found out and we worked out through the pandemic, a lot of those things can be changed at the point of need. So why not change those more sustainably to allow creativity and flexibility to happen? Love that. Really great stuff. Room 6, assessment that embraces the uses of generative AI effectively. again, not going to be able to move for this. AI literacy, I just think it's a broader definition of digital literacy. I think we're there now. I think we're probably into the space of what my colleague here at Teesside, Anne Thanaraj, calls digital fluency. Not her term, I don't think, but it's how we operationalize things here at Teesside. So the digital fluency, the toolkit that students have in the digital space, enabling students to clearly develop their evaluative judgment. Again, great work. Love that. To going very much into that whole idea of assessment as learning. Yeah. So how do I self-monitor, self-evaluate, self-regulate my learning, my own kind of learning strategies and the like. Assessment that reflects diversity of the student body. Again, couldn't agree more. Does the current assessment portfolio in the sector reflect the diversity of students undertaking higher education courses? It's a hypothetical question, because of course the answer is probably not, if we've only got roughly 10 different types of assessment played out on average. So we need to look at that, don't we? We really do, more longer term. Just an extra point being added there. Authentic assessment is becoming more important. Purposeful assessment, on-purpose assessment, applicability to real world. Students need to see value and has the benefit in developing skills design through assessment. Absolutely right. Going back to what matters most, let's have that conversation with our students. We have that conversation with our students. Does that change the conversation? Well, it absolutely should do. And let's be clear, I've done that with students many, many times and had the same started the same conversation, but it's a completely different conversation with students. So if we're having the different conversations to our students in terms of what matters most, although yes, we are the educational experts, but ultimately they're coming in this with their own motivation, wants and needs. How are we meeting them where they are? And how can assessment moving forward do those things? So really great work. Okay, so feel free to keep adding to that. Some really, really nice insights there. I'm mindful of time, so I'm going to come out here. I'm going to see all your faces again, so apologies for that. Cue lots of blank screens. So really great work. And what's really interesting again about that activity, lots of commonality in what you guys are seeing and thinking about in terms of what's going to matter most moving forward. And work that we've been doing here at Teesside, and in work I'm involved in with different universities and projects across the sector, is also very much operating in this space of a future perspective on assessment, and with inclusion and flexibility at its core. And I want to share some work in that space with you now. So going back to my my main resource here. Right, Leslie, can you see that, please? Yeah, perfect. Okay, this is going so well. Something's going to break in a minute. Yeah, yes, I would like to resume slide. Thank you. Right, so we've just done that. So I'm going to talk to you about the work that we've been involved in. I'm going to give, Jan Davison in the chat will say, can you give us some examples of, the idea of flexibility in assessment and, its broader idea of inclusion. I'm going to try and do that now through some of the work that we've developed, and obviously share some of that practice with you. This is all again available. You can QR code it there if you want to get up on your phone or device. It's all linked in through the interactive resource bank that will be shared with you. So this is actually at an institutional level. This is work that we've done and I've led here at Teesside around embedding flexibility in assessment at scale. It's something we did kind of midway through the pandemic, learning as we went, and then ultimately it's now part and parcel of our assessment feedback policy and strategy here at the university. And we settled on three kind of core working principles for flexible assessment. The first one being inclusive, flexible assessment is inclusive, learning focused, shared and transparent. So first and foremost, we need to think about our assessment processes as a way of opening up, allowing, optimizing access, being equitable and relevant to the learning experience for all our students across the mode of study. That's the first principle. For me, that's a non-negotiable. Learning focused. So assessment activities need to be aligned, which is something that everybody's picked up on. Absolutely, we're not saying they don't, but actually they need to be aligned at a course level. They need to be able to, students need to be able to see where they're going, where this fits in the broader context of the journey of their course, to ensure that assessment processes and tasks are authentic to where they are now, to what they're being asked to do now, but also designed to achieve key outcomes overall and direct students towards the kinds of learning that we want to see them demonstrate. So what are we modeling for? And that needs, for me, learning development is a key driver. So that learning focused principle was core. But none of that happens if we don't have a shared appreciation with our students of what matters most. And going back to that question of what matters most. So assessment feedback process is clearly articulated, relevant to context, designed to enable meaningful action in ways that foster the student learning that we want to see demonstrated. We need to be clear on how we're communicating with our students on what matters most, the degree to which they're involved in that actively as agents. And so partnership is a big part of that for us. So these three working principles are now core to how we think and work with the idea of assessment. And something that we've done and written about, so that's there, you can read about that. That's how we've scaled it or tried to scale it through the pandemic and beyond. So that's at an institutional level. At a practice level, we've also worked with our colleagues across the university to do the learning from, you know, hybrid modes of delivery and having to look again and think again and work differently in the assessment space and understand what's stuck and why. So what do we know now? Well, this is Rachel Dodds. She's a colleague of mine in digital journalism. She's a very early advocate of, some of you might know that we were the first European Adobe Creative Campus. But Rachel's work predated that Adobe partnership. So looking at bundling up the formative and summative assessment activities that she did, but utilizing different platforms and devices and technologies available to her. So looking at the different assemblages of practices, so with very much a process focus. So, you know, prioritizing the formative over the summative almost, and the summative being a culmination of the formative. And it's a really interesting piece of work, but something, again, very much learning focused, highly inclusive, and is very much a shared endeavor with their students. So those principles playing out. So you can scan that there at your leisure and read that in a bit more depth. Some other work that I was involved in with my colleague Sam Gunaratne, so chemical engineering. So again, a completely different disciplinary kind of context, was Sam's fantastic work around using Microsoft OneNote class notebooks to help facilitate differentiated formative assessment and feedback for our students. So being able to work at different levels individually and with peer groups with real learning benefit for using those collaborative tools. So, you know, collaboration around peer review, peer feedback around formative tasks, self-determined progress, so students can check in with her through this process on an individual level, providing instructional support from her for her, and then back to students, so they get a sense of where students are at, what she needed to do to improve, but also found that it was a strong socio-emotional support for students in an ability to be able to feedback on a personal level, and not just kind of, you know, it's a large course in chemical engineering, so it was an opportunity to work at that individual level, but a way that was scalable for her working as an individual member of staff. So again, check that out. Really, really interesting piece of work. Work we did with our School of Health around, you know, obviously faced significant challenges, as many of you in the health sectors will attest to, maintaining a certain level of authenticity in the assessment. They were having to think very differently about how they were doing their practical assessments, for example. And actually, we found through this work with Paul Cheston and Phil Cosson, just the plausibility, the feasibility, the strength of the multimodality or the multimodal strategies for assessment that were being deployed there. So allowing for effective access to assessment information in different locations, which is obviously, when you're on placement, for example, really key. Engage a broader range of tasks. So allowing the formative in as well as the summative. Automated feedback was something that was utilized. And obviously that streamlined things and made things more responsive. Learning focused dialogue. So if you're not spending all your time writing the feedback, you can spend more time in dialogue with your students and then supporting a productive peer and group assessment structure as well. So actually, it's not having to be the tutor as the instigator the whole time, but actually empowering and structuring mechanisms in a way that actually empower peer groups to work on assessment. So, you know, key learning for us here: educators must try to design assessments that foster kinds of attitudes and dispositions, and not just the knowledge and skills that learners will need to know for a variety of different situations in which they'll confront. So rather than, again, making that task genre or task focused design decision, actually thinking about the situations and circumstances, what kind of skill sets and dispositions are students going to need to continue to be able to learn and adapt within those. and surely we should be assessing for that. So the multimodality really played out there. And more recently, this is another great piece of work. I would say that because I wrote it. But the article there is not out yet. It's out next month in Studies in in Technology Enhanced Learning, but that's actually drawing on a collaborative innovation project which we led, and I led at Teesside, around embedding inclusive assessment, lessons from large-scale assessment change. This was a collaborative project. This was a collaboration between 8 different universities across the sector. They were all University Alliance, Mission Group institutions, and we came together to do the learning. There's a whole raft of resources. If you scan that, they're yours. You can dig into that, and we haven't got the time to really dig into it in too much depth here. But we developed a series based on what had worked for the different in the context of having a positive impact on student attention and attainment in terms of the alternative assessment arrangements that were made, their impacts on that data set, and then going to the source, going to those courses that had performed so highly in that space, talking to the students that had experienced that. We devised a series of inclusive assessment attributes, which then informed a case study series and a toolkit. And that's something that's openly available. It's open access. Just click, scan that, click the resource, and it's yours. But what do we learn from this? Well, what it showed us was we're in a post-digital era, whether we like it or not. By that I mean, no longer are we divided into online, offline delivery, on campus, off campus experiences. They are blended together, to use a term that we're all familiar with. We're going to come into this in a little while as well. We're going to unpack that a bit more. But what it showed us was, assessment designs, when successful, need to be adaptable to how students might navigate and satisfy learning outcomes. Recognizing that because of their circumstances, the scenarios, the challenges they might face beyond the 4 walls of the university, they might need a certain degree of flexibility in order to achieve those ends. But actually there are multiple ends, and what we need to do through our assessments is not close students off, but open them up to the possibilities for learning. And that requires a dynamic shared relationship between the teacher and the student. We've got to know who our students are. We've got to spend some time with them. How do we sit? Paul Kleiman, way back when I was at the HEA, and no doubt he's still talking about it now. He talked about the etymology of the word assessment, and actually what it means when you strip it right back is to sit next to, which I love. Yeah. So if are we truthfully sitting next to our students in the way that we set up our assessments? Don't have to answer that. I know the answer. So thinking about the digital tools and technologies we deploy, how we can then use those to broker more positive and proactive relationships requires a more proficient skill set. We have to be more proficient in the design of flexible assessment, but also the orchestration of assessment. So it puts an emphasis on, the in-practice orchestration of our interactions with our students for the purposes of assessment, in the unfolding of those experiences, rather than going, what I would call a very transactional kind of model that we typically have is, right, here's the task, here's the different opportunities you've got to engage with me on it, produce an artifact, and I'll produce my own artifact on that in terms of feedback, and we'll move on. That's a very transactional model. This requires a more process orientated, a more participative model. So reframing how educators make judgments, not about assessment in general terms, kind of general tasks or whatever, but about the combinations and configurations of the diverse practice elements that we think will help students move forward and develop in the ways that we want to see demonstrated. So there's some real key learning here across different levels of work, the institutional work, the practice level and subject level work, but also the work we've been doing across the sector. So all of that plays out in different ways, and I've got some work. I'm going to bring all this together. I'm going to present a loose framework for thinking around this. But at this moment in time, I'm going to do something that might be unusual to you, but I'm going to pause for questions now because we've covered quite a bit of ground. We're pretty much halfway through the session. It's an opportunity to kind of take a time to pause and really spend some time together on any questions that you might have right at this stage, based on what we've covered, based on your conversations with each other in the first task. but also the information and the work you've heard about so far. So you can raise your hand, pop a question in the chat, or you can upload your question to the Padlet, the Q&A Padlet there, and we can come at those. So we've got one hand up. I can't see who it is, unfortunately. Letty, can you see who that is?
Yes, I can. I'm just going to. I've got Emil first. Got a few hands up.
But I think that before me was Love, maybe, or not.
Oh,
no,
sorry.
not.
Yes. Yes, please go ahead.
Yes.
They're coming in a different order on my screen.
Yeah,
but,
thank you. There's so many
No,
of you. It's difficult to tell.
Yeah, it's all right. Thank you so much for this really interesting discourse that you've triggered, and it's really made me think a lot. But one thing that, when it comes to assessment, one thing that usually bothers me is issues around scalability.
Mm-hmm.
And my question is, to what extent should that be? Well, as an economist, I suppose I have an answer.
Yes. So scalability. So question about how do we scale this is the question. Is that right?
More like how do you make sure that the assessment, I mean, maybe I should give a context. I had an idea for an assessment process, which I thought would have really delivered the learning outcome, but the constraint was that the resources to deliver that was limited. You need to assess, you needed a number of people which you could not afford.
Yeah.
So to what extent should, so scalability in that sense? Yeah.
Yeah, no, lovely. Really great question. Something I think everybody is grappling with when we're trying to change assessment at all. And obviously assessment change, as we know, is challenging. In terms of scaling that, for me, the unit of analysis that matters most here is the program. So we need to situate our changes and our dialogue at the level of the program. Why is that? Well, when it comes to resources, when it comes to the coherence and alignment, we need to make sure that all of that is clear, firstly, so that, you know, in terms of the rationale for change, we need to understand it in the context of the course. But when it comes to sustaining it, so for me, there's two sides to the same coin here when it comes to assessment change or operationalizing changes of this nature. Firstly, the first side of the coin is the pragmatist in me. So it's whatever we do has to be manageable. Whatever we do has to be manageable for us within the resource restrictions that we have. So, you know, we might, and there comes a point, of course, that, you know, if enough people on the course are wanting to change assessment in a certain way, then we have to look at the resources at a program level, which is absolutely what I would advocate for. But if we're looking at an individual level, as you are, you know, we need to think about, okay, I want to be doing this. In an ideal world, I'd be doing all of this. There'd be no time restrictions. We'd be having plenty of opportunities to engage. Well, how is this manageable for me? But then more importantly, perhaps on the same side of the coin, is this manageable for the students? Is it feasible for them to complete at this stage? Do they have the necessary skills to do this? Will they have the time? Do they have access to the resources? Can I work with those considerations to make sure that I'm creating the opportunities there? Only then will those opportunities be sustained. But also the other side to that coin is that sustainability. Are they just going to get this once from me or on the course, or is this going to be sustained beyond the module, beyond this task? Because if it's not, why am I doing it? We're not going to pick this up, going back to that idea of ipsative assessment. It's learning development. If we do something once, this isn't a ladder to be thrown away once climbed. This is something we need to revisit, but perhaps at a higher level. So for me, when it comes to scalability and operationalization, you know, actually it's about those two things, manageability and sustainability. I could go into more depth. We've got more questions, and I'm mindful of time. So who was next? We've got Emil.
Emil and then Ian.
Okay, lovely. Emil.
Okay, thank you. So my question is, I don't know if it's a question, if it's a comment, and it's maybe a little bit to the side of what we are talking about, but I think it's quite relevant in the context of assessment. So basically, one of the things that I sit on a mitigation panel in my department. This was raised also by Julia in our working group breakout room. One thing that online assessment created was this phenomenon of technical mitigation.
Yeah.
Basically, students are very troubled with online assessment in ways that I don't have long enough memory, but I feel that this shouldn't have been the case before the era of online assessment and stuff like this. And this raises not only issues of integrity, important considerations of integrity, but also questions about well-being, questions about probably what is the optimal technological kind of platform for doing exams and so forth. But I think that if we are talking about assessment moving online forever, this is definitely something that assessment strategies need to internalize. Because the scale of what is happening in terms of technical mitigation is, maybe many of you are aware, is basically crazy. And I wonder if this features somehow in the debate about assessment for the future.
Well, I think it almost certainly does. There's a lot of nodding heads, by the way. So I think this is certainly something we're seeing in the context of the conversation discourse right now around AI and the whole, the fallacy, I guess, of the ability to design out AI or some way, or to design in greater integrity. For me, integrity is an interesting one. There's different ways of getting there, but for me, the assessment design is core to that. If we're going to insist on operationalizing exams the way that we've always operationalized them, then, we will, I was, like I say, I'm trying not to mention SATs, but, I was just a complex that week because I was walking around on the campus and there was in-face exams going on, timed, constrained traditional examinations, and at home I was dealing with an 11-year-old going through the same thing, and I was like, well, there are alternative available methods here. Why are we having to do these things? But actually, if we're going to do these things, I agree with you, those technical mitigation, but also, can we look at the conditions that we're placing upon students that aren't necessarily required to demonstrate their learning? So, for example, a big one for me, and this is kind of a construct that just will explode, and something I think we need to spend a lot more emphasis on, is the idea of time. So a time phased thing. Well, actually, what we found was by creating a greater window of time, it actually minimized, if you talk, certainly from our perspective, the work that we've done, it started to mitigate some of those issues around student well-being and anxiety. So actually just changing the time frame of assessment actually played out quite positively. Obviously, that brings in different challenges as well, but also the access to, thinking about it at the point of design, if we're going to do, and I would probably push against the all assessment moving online all of the time. I think we're in that kind of post-digital era now, but it's understanding the mix, it's understanding the blend, it's what works best and what do we need to do to best draw out and evidence student learning the way that we want it to be demonstrated. But if we're setting up these things, what is it that we want students to do and demonstrate? If it's just factual recall, then okay, but surely it's more than that. So I think we are asking slightly broader questions here. So the long answer to your very important question is I don't think anybody's cracked this as such, but I do think it does require a bit more rethinking, certainly around time and what it is we're asking them to do, but also the whole idea of digital equity is very much at the core of this as well. So just shifting everything to that space, online space. Well, not everybody has the same access to the same things in the same ways. Equally, time is inequitable. We don't all have access to the same time in the same way. We might say, you're in for 2 hours, but that's fine. But I might have caring responsibilities and X, Y, and Z. So we need to think about all of these things together. And I think you've actually hit the nail on the head around student well-being. If we were to make it a human-centered design decision, I think we're moving the right direction. We're going to go to Ian, and then we'll move on, if that's okay, colleagues.
Hi, good morning. So about halfway through, you referenced MacArthur 2021. The slide was titled Rethinking Student Involvement in Authentic Assessment. I didn't understand it. Please, could you explain that as if I was an 11-year-old?
Oh, happily. Yeah, no, I'm in that space right now. No, I understand. Jan's work, Jan MacArthur's work is challenging, you know, in the sense that it does challenge some of the assumptions and the tacit beliefs and values of assessment. So what Jan's saying really at bottom is what is the purpose of assessment, you know, here, and looking at the idea, because obviously we were very much in this space of, you know, we need more authentic assessment. Okay, what does that mean? What does authentic assessment have to do? So thinking about the purposes of that, and then coming at it from the perspective of, you know, broadly human development, and actually being able to, for students being future citizens, for example, and future work colleagues, what do we need to do through assessments that is going to better prepare our students to work, to operate in that, in a future environment? So it's less of a skills-based kind of approach and more of a, well, what's this? What does this mean from a human perspective? So there's a very philosophical spin to that. So I appreciate the question and the request for clarity, but hopefully that works.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you very much.
No problem at all. And again, colleagues, the Q&A pad that's there for any other kind of instances where, you know, I might have skated over something you want to spend a bit more time on. So please make use of that. But in the interest of time, we'll move on. And I realise that people are making comments in the chat as well. I'm just going to quickly scan. Yeah, Joanne's kind of highlighted some of the more kind of the practical issues as well as the technical issues around 24-hour open access papers online. You know, fair access to these things. You know, what is fairness? What is equity? And I think, you know, what we've got and what we are going back to the idea of diversity, the diversity of students. You know, it's not just the diversity in terms of who they are, but it's also a diversity of students of where they are and how they access higher education, and you know that needs to be recognised as well. And that's certainly something that is the root cause of that. And Laura's made a great point there around, you know, moving stuff online, being more open in our assessments means giving some control over and losing a bit more control. That's also going back to the point around integrity. You know, how much of the idea of integrity in the assessment space is about control, and you know, controlling security of standards is obviously important. It's how we're measured, but again, what it tends to do, it all tends to be is a very reductive approach to assessment, particularly in terms of, right, we need to reduce this right down to these things, and anything that falls outside of that, you know, is not acceptable. Well, actually, you know, are there different ways of achieving those ends? And I think that's something we are obviously grappling with. I think we're having this conversation at all because that is the case. But okay, good stuff. Really appreciate the engagement. I thought it would be useful to pop a opportunity for questions midway through. I'm glad that's worked out. But please do keep posting your questions and comments, and we'll try and get around to as many of those as possible. Okay. So I said at the top of the conversation, where we want to end up with this is like what was promised almost was, you know, in terms of the title of the piece, of course, is a reframing and how we might do that. So I want to try and do that in the context of the learning from the work that I've shared and talked about, the work that's ongoing, but also drawing again on some of the current research literature. And what I think we can establish pretty clearly is we need to think about how we might reframe or work with assessment in different ways so as to better meet students where they are. Yeah, so in terms of having that connection and then engagement with students, and what that requires, it requires a very different way of framing assessment. So this would suggest assessment being framed as a, you know, and we've discussed it in these terms, as a set of complex curriculum practices that engage and influence students and staff, as well as producing information about how students work and the work that they produce, how that can be recorded and utilised. So so very what I'm proposing here is that this requires a practice perspective. So shifting away from a task to the practice, to the doing, the practical realities. This perspective marks a shift in focus from the ways assessment should be, in terms of this is what assessment looks like. Of course, this is what it should do and should be, to a focus on the ways it is in terms of how it's lived out. And so a move from focusing on assessment judgments overall to a focus towards considering the work that we do and the context that we operate within alongside our students. So again, going back to that kind of etymological standpoint, now how do we get closer to our students? How do we work alongside our students? Well, a practice emphasis starts to move us in that direction. So the assumption underpinning traditional assessment, of course, is that various kinds of assessment activities can be designed to measure particular learning outcomes. I won't get into unpacking the tyranny of outcomes. Phil Race has done that, and other colleagues as well. So outcomes, depending on how you define them, can be both good and bad in that sense, or the characteristic of students that the purpose of research or the work that we do is to improve the efficacy of what is going on. And so coming back to the purpose of assessment, what is the purpose of assessment here? Is it about measuring particular learning outcomes? Well, that's part of it, but going back to that graphic we shared earlier on around the multiple purposes of assessment, well, that's not the whole thing. So this traditional view does have a profound influence in how we see assessment and what is valued as assessed work and what we do through the assessment work. However, in doing so, it prioritizes certain kinds of purposes, effects, and outcomes that represent only part of what we see as the wider enterprise of assessment. So we need to open things up, and a practice perspective, I suggest, allows us to start to move into that space. So how do we better meet students where they are? Well, it's about this practice perspective contextualizes assessment as sites for practice. So what are we doing? Where is that work happening? What does that look like? And connected to what goes on in those locations at any given time and how we're paying attention to that. For me, a program-focused view is central to this because it's an integrated view of assessment and feedback delivered over time. So if we're going to meet students where they are, we need to understand where they are now, where they've been, but also where they're going to in the context of their learning. So it requires a program-focused view. But it's also viewed in terms of, this is going back to some of the work we've just discussed, the idea that actually practices developing certain dispositions and strategies, learning strategies for our students, engaging and influencing our students in that learning and producing information about their work to inform future development. So actually it's a way of looking, it's a way of doing, it's an outlook as well as a task to be done. And Bowd and colleagues have done some interesting work in this practice-based approach to assessment, and they've used the term assessment as practice. So how do we how do we get closer to assessments and meet them where they are? Well, we've got to view assessment as it's practiced. We have to have a view of assessment as it's practiced. The various facets of the human and material activities that constitute assessment. By that they mean their location, particular times and places, the relationships between the individuals, and the various kinds of information, provisions, documentation, or how they're utilised, produced, and what comes out of that. So we're shifting our perspective from assessment as a thing to be done and a way that it should be done in a certain way to assessment as it is practiced with students is a key shift in emphasis for me, and really does bring to the fore a different kind of unit of analysis, because it brings that practice focus to the conversation. What this does, it emphasizes a certain degree of acknowledgement of our learning and teaching regimes. It brings into focus and provides useful insights into the idea and the importance of our teaching and learning regimes as they are related to assessment, because they do shape and frame everything we do. So by that I mean, in terms of how we set up our assessments, the power relations within that. So who holds the power, where and how those power relations operate. The implicit theories, the conventions and tacit assumptions of our learning and teaching strategies as a whole. how these shape and inform our recurrent practices over time. So what becomes best practice? What becomes accepted practice? All of these things play out all of the time through the way that we operationalize things at a local level. And this is done through discursive repertoires and habits of practice. So what are our own habits of practice in the assessment space? How have they come about? What do they say about the power relations and the theories and conventions of assessment? And do they need to change? And have they changed? This is what I'm referring to here, is the practice realities of us as educators, and how these teaching and learning regimes are permeable. They're natural systems rather than reductive, closed and clearly bounded entities. And this is what Paul Trowler's talked about in his great book around practice sensibility, is recognizing how this all plays out. It's not a linear thing. It's not a series of mechanisms to be applied kind of objectively, but it's a system of work that we do and work with alongside our students all of the time. As such, our practices are always bundled. According to Tim Fawns, they're entangled and nested within wider systems and modalities of practice. And we need to recognize that, we need to understand that, and we need to try and work out ways of working with that entanglement with a view to operationalizing it in a way that meets the kinds of learning development outcomes that we want to see. Gravett and Ajawi talk about the social materiality of these practices. They involve a set of social and material practices, they say, performed in a particular context which are related to learning and teaching issues. All of this hangs together in this practice sensibility. So what I'm advocating for here, and what this work advocates for, is a more pragmatic outlook on these practices, because these are, as Senevo says here, I mean, 2001, but it's still relevant in my mind in terms of the pragmatic regimes of our practices. These are the situated devices that orientate and govern the ways that we engage with and understand our environment. Equally, if we go back to the point that was made around Jang MacArthur's work, what's the equivalent for students? How do we want to, what's the role for assessment practice in terms of orientating and governing the ways that we want students to engage with and understand their own environments, both at the university and beyond? So, the advocation here is for a more pragmatic outlook and a more practice-centered approach. Building on the learning that we've done through the work that I've shared already, I want to position this really as assessment as practice. Okay, so we think about assessment as practice. We need to think of quite a bit at the same time here. So we need to think about practice as outcomes, yes. So, how we get people, students involved, providing students with equivalent rather than identical opportunities to demonstrate their ability, and embed certain arrangements of process that are relevant, constitutive, as well as prospective for their learning as outcomes. We need to hold that, but we also need to hold practice with an S as processes. So thinking about the adaptive learning designs that we might be able to utilize and integrate. Utilize integrated formative activities to emphasize that process and to scaffold for the kinds of learning and model for the kinds of engagement we want to see, as well as enabling for the developmental feedback to take hold in process, focusing on progress of our students, encouraging them to adapt more effective, active, participative and dialogic roles. So we need to, when we're talking about assessment as practice, what I'm suggesting is we need to hold both of these ideas of practice in our minds at the same time, because this is the outcome of practical judgment grounded in the subjective experiences that we have with our students. And it's more responsive in that sense. We're focusing on assessment as practice. We are then paying attention to what's going on in practice, and we are therefore more responsive to the complexity and multiplicity of demands that we're facing. It's an interesting way of framing. It's a different way of framing, and it's something I want us to consider in a bit more depth. And obviously we only have a very small time together, a small amount of time together today. But what I've tried to do here, this is the culmination of work that's ongoing. Okay, so drawing together key learning in the inclusive assessment space, both from the work that I'm involved in here at Teesside, the work that I'm learning from the various research going on in the sector, but also the projects and development work that I'm involved in with the sector, and trying to position this in a way that is operationalizable. So what I've tried to present here are what are in effect 4 practice frames for inclusive assessment. And this is the way for me of trying to operationalize in this practice assessment as practice outlook. So it's situated across 2 axes really, if you look at things. So from a process to a task focus, recognizing that we do, yes, there's an element that we do have to be practice outcomes focused to a point, and we need to therefore focus on certain tasks in terms of doing something, but we also need to situate that within the broader process. But we also need to recognize that we will need to model certain things, learning models, strategies for work, notions of quality for our students, and so forth. That there's going to be elements of this which are going to need to be tutor-led, but ultimately we want things to then become more student-led in how students kind of start to self-direct and self-regulate their work and ultimately express their learning. So situating that within 4 frames, we have the situated frame there, which is really all about student learning, student engagement, how we engage students. So it's situating authentic learning models. So for example, we might use simulation as a way of doing this. So modeling for certain kinds of authentic learning that we want students to adopt and think about, seeking out and using information to inform and develop individual perspectives and learning goals within that. So that's a situative, it's how we situate that, partly process focused, but certainly led and scaffolded by us as tutors. We also need to think about what that means for them in terms of working with key concepts. So this is the more directive frame, developing a working appreciation of tasks and learning requirements. So what does good look like? Notions of quality. What am I working towards? What do I need to use here in terms of key concepts and ideas? And it's really encouraging them to contribute more meaningfully to the activities around exploring and experimenting with key themes and ideas. But again, we need to model that in certain ways. It needs to be situated within that those authentic learning models. And it certainly needs to be more task focused in terms of what it is we're going to ask them to do and ultimately produce. But we need to then start to give over a bit more control to our students. So we want them to think more proximally about what that means for them in terms of the task and their learning, actively working with and evidencing the assessment criteria as they see it. So formulating and learning effective learning strategy. So this is where the self-regulatory element comes into it. So allowing them through that earlier experimentation of ideas and concepts to get a sense of, okay, well, how do I fit with this? How can I best demonstrate my learning? And then ultimately, we want the students to feel that they have the ability to express and apply that learning. And that's that distal frame. So it's like, again, that future perspective, if you like, connecting to and articulating those learning goals and outcomes in ways that make best sense to them and in the work and representing the work that they've done. So that's student led, but with a process focus. So this is all new. You're coming to this cold. 4 practice frames for inclusive assessment. And in terms of operationalizing what is a whole raft of very disparate work that's been ongoing, and also bringing the idea of assessment as practice to life, this is where I'm at, I guess, in terms of doing that. But I want to encourage us to spend a bit of time, and again, this is out there, this is open to interrogation. This is why I'm doing this, is why I'm presenting this, and we're going to spend a bit of time just now, 10 minutes or so, looking at this in the next breakout activity. So you'll have this in the chat. So what I want you to do is consider the graphic, these different frames, and what might be positioned there in terms of effective activities that map to each of those practice frames. So, for example, the situated learner engagement frame, we've talked about simulation. There might be some gamification in there. There might be some problem-based work. The directive working with concepts. Okay, so there might be working with the criteria for assessment, some exemplar-based work, how we do that, maybe getting some peer-to-peer engagement. And then with the proximal kind of meaning-making frame, this is the self-regulation. We're going to hand over some of that control and emphasis to the students. So we might get them to blog about their progress. We might get them to share draft artifact with their peers and kind of orchestrate a peer review process in that space. And ultimately, when it comes to the distal frame and expressing an application of learning, well, what are the different ways that we can do that? Creative artifacts, patchwork assessment, that kind of thing. So just to give you some examples, but I want you to spend some time on this. We only have 10 minutes, of course, and we'll come together at the end. But I I want you to identify a range of effective activities if you can. Think about your own practice. Can you situate what you do in your own practice within these frames? Are there, from other people's experiences, other alternatives? This is what the sharing part of this activity is all about. So again, same as before, Michelle's going to allocate you to these groups. I want you to capture that in the Padlet under the situated, directive, proximal and distal frames where you can. Again, no right or wrong answer to this, that you've come at this relatively cold. But it's just something to work with. It's another way of looking and working. So over to Michelle to allocate groups, and then we'll come back after 10 minutes and we'll look at what we've got. So hopefully that all makes sense. You're on mute, Michelle. I think it is, if you're trying to say something.
Yep, just sending everybody through now.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. I think we're going to be using up all the time, Letty. I think the
yeah, no, that's absolutely fine. I've seen messages and a couple of colleagues have messaged on another channel to say, really sorry, we need to leave.
It's an artifact now. We're recording it. It's an artifact. They can come back and listen.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, it's great. There's so much there, and there's lots of questions in the chat. There's some. I really love the fact as well that it's generating some conversations between colleagues in the chat. So hopefully that will continue as well. Michelle has just put her camera off. I was just going to say, Michelle, yeah, no, just obviously before sharing the recording, we're going to edit this section.
Yes,
off,
yeah,
so that
chopped out. So yeah. This will be fine.
No, absolutely, yeah.
So as long as you think it's, you know, I think the key thing for me was for it to be a generative thing. So rather than just me talking for 90 minutes or something, I think which can be useful to a point. I'd rather have a bit of interaction, and obviously there's colleagues outside of Warwick as well. So you've come back out again, love.
Yeah, I got kicked out again.
No problem. Michelle,
I'll
reassign you.
Beam you in again.
No problem. You're in number 5, aren't you?
Yes.
5. Yeah. Bear with me a moment. Just finding you.
And it's fascinating. I was reading through the chat, and some of the questions are actually going back to the points that we were discussing earlier.
Yeah.
So it's really interesting to see those conversations emerge.
Yeah, I think it is. That's exactly what it is. It's conversation, and we do need to change the conversation. I think just bringing that, for me at least, once you see it, you can't unsee it in terms of that practice perspective. We don't tend to, our outlook is very task orientated, as Margaret Bierman says, but what are the practices inherent within that? And if we focus on the practices, you can get quite literal and intentional about things. So if we want to shape for certain types of learning, it's not the task that does it, because that's what they do. It's how they do it, which is the practice.
Absolutely. So I think, I was thinking about, in a way, why we are in the situation that we are, and that there's so many different reasons. But one of the things that I think, at least in our experience here, one of the things that have happened is, so we did a review of assessment. We were pushing that discourse around the diversification of assessment pre-pandemic, and we had made initial steps in that direction, trying to get colleagues, to go back to the drawing board, as you say, thinking about, that intentionality of approaches in the way they design assessment. And then the pandemic hit, and there was a situation where diversification happened not for the right reasons and not in the right way, and in a very rushed way. So it's trying to sort of now capitalize on both and see how we make the most of what colleagues have had to deal with in terms of the process that they'd started on, but also then that acceleration that forced them to perhaps not think as deeply as they should have, or So yeah, but it's fascinating, and we're definitely, you know, at least here, this is so relevant as a discussion now. It's really a key focus for us, and from conversations with colleagues. And it's interesting, you recognize probably, I don't know if you've had a chance to look at the list of participants, you might recognize a few names. There are a few colleagues, educational developers from other universities as well. That
I do reckon. Same old face. But I think we're all dealing with this because, you know, in the AD space, you know, what we are brokers for these conversations.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know, and you know, I've had conversations with Lydia Arnold about this, and you know, we are brokers of that, and in a way, it does have to come from us, because, you know, or that level of colleague, simply because, you know, very often, you know, program teams are looking for us for permission to do these things, to think differently, to work differently, and I think that for me is a really key observation. But I mean, I'd be very keen. I mean, you know, we're limited in what we can do in the space today, but if you wanted to continue the conversation, I'd be very happy to.
Yeah, brilliant. Absolutely. I think looking at the interaction today, I think we should definitely, and maybe we think about how, you know, sort of building it into the follow up to today's sessions, because there's definitely so much emerging from the questions, and so many common challenges as well. No, I think it's brilliant.
So we've got there's quite a bit in the Q&A one. So what I'll do is I'll prioritize questions in the room, and I'll say to colleagues, I'll respond to all the points in the Q&A Padlet for next week, if that's okay.
And absolutely. I've put a message in the chat to say also there are quite a few questions in the chat. We'll just copy the chat and make sure to pass those on.
We can pull those through, and then what I'll do is I'll put it all together in a singular Padlet, if you like, in the Q&A Padlet, and then they can all go to that one source.
Fantastic.
So they're all going to be asking similar, you know, they might be sat on similar questions,
there are,
but no, it's all good stuff. Like I said, a lot of this is, you know, certainly the practice-based stuff is still very much in development for me, because, you know, this is where I'm at, you know, saying meeting people where they are, this is where I am with the work, you know, and I think for me there is no alternative to this. AI, I think, is just going to accelerate this, the need for this.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So you can see how maybe you'd use the frames here to reframe assessment, to start to negotiate some of the challenges of AI. So to have a more process focus, but knowing when to then be more task focused, and, you know, maybe bringing in you know, AI in the directive and proximal frames, for example, you know, that kind of thing. So you can see how it might be used as a way of operationalizing different ways of working and thinking. I'm literally writing this up as I go. You know, there's a presentation at Assessment HE conference in June, which will touch on this. But then, you know, I'm hoping to get this, you know, what this turns into. I think it's going to be, I don't know. This is where these kind of opportunities.
It's a process.
It is, but you know, this is feedback to me on the model. So, you know, this is how I've come to understand this. Is it useful to you? Is, you know, like I said at the top of the conversation, I'm trying this out, and hopefully it's a different way of thinking for colleagues that they might find useful.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's brilliant. And you know, it's a different way of co-creating knowledge.
It is.
It's what we advocate all the time. It's what we advocate all the time that we should do with with learners, and so that's absolutely.
But what
fantastic.
it is, of course, Letty, is feedback, right? So what I'm saying is, I need formative feedback in the process here. So again, trying to practice what I preach. Also, by the way, you know, there's different ways of there's a multimodal element to this: verbal, written, text-based, whatever. So just subtly trying to show people that there are different ways of doing this and getting at different alternative ways of looking and working.
No, absolutely.
So we'll wait and see. I think we probably timed things just perfectly as well. So
I think so, yes. And you know, I was thinking that, you know, in our conversation yesterday, we thought there should be, you know, there would be extra time to, but actually I did think that the conversation was going to, you know, the Q&A was going to take potentially, you know, if we'd had more time, that would have taken, if you wanted to answer all the questions that were coming up.
It was an opportunity to, I mean, it was good that we did, and for the exact reason
Yeah.
Ian's question was the exact reason to do that. So
Yeah.
right, yeah, I think I get it, but can you explain it so I understand it? You know,
Yeah.
that's checking for understanding. I think a central Q&A is really helpful for that.
Yeah, absolutely.
And we'll get to some of the questions at the end as well, hopefully as well. So we'll see how we go.
No,
So,
it's brilliant. I'm super excited about this. I think it's going brilliantly. I was also thinking we might I'll put you in touch with one of our colleagues who works on AI. She's done some fantastic work using AI for feedback. Might put you in touch with her.
Yeah, that'd be great. No, I'm always keen to learn. I think, and the more dialogue we have in that space, particularly, I think is a
we
good
have
one.
a few colleagues who are back into the main room.
Yeah,
they're all coming back.
Dripping in now, limping in. Okay, I'm just looking at the Padlet. If colleagues can try and get something up there, that'd be fantastic. Obviously we can take a more dialogic approach to this. I'm absolutely fine, comfortable doing that as well. I know 10 minutes to look at and consider something you've never seen before is massively unfair, but I did want us to we have till hour, so I did want to leave some space for Q&A as well. But we can get into this just now. So let me re-find you and then share my screen. And then,
Room 2 I've now added to the Padlet. So.
Wonderful. So let's look at this then. Letty, can you see that? Perfect. Thank you very much. Okay, so we'll make some general observations here, I think, and then possibly get into a bit of discussion around this. Obviously, what all this is well, in effect, a heuristic. It's a way of looking and working, and a suggested looking at working at that, but based on the work that I've spoken to and about today, kind of culmination of the learning from that work, and trying to position it in a way that would hopefully be useful. So the one comment there, I'm assuming that's room 1. Our assessment tasks typically fall in the task focus zone, so it's kind of the bottom half of the graphic there, which is unsurprising, I guess, in a way, given that's largely, like I say, going back to Margaret Bierman's comment around being task focused in traditional assessment design, being task focused overall, doesn't surprise me. But I guess the question then is, how could you also operationalize across that more, the process focused quadrants of the diagram, recognizing that we need to situate that learning authentically, model for that, but also allow for the expression of an application of that work in ways that make sense to students. Where are we going next? We're going to go to room 2, environmental impact assessment, situative. Oh, interesting. Okay, really like that. Yeah, okay, so thinking more broadly, sustainability wise, students write a field guide and can decide on how to present that, vlog, task. Yeah, okay, so what I love about that room 2 is you actually working around the quadrants at the point, thinking about the different practices involved. So, okay, you've got you started with the situative frame, environmental impact, kind of modeling for that, all kind of authentic learning. Then you're thinking about ways of working with concepts, documenting that in terms of meaning making, in terms of that more proximal frame, and then ultimately bringing that through to different ways they might represent that or capture that, express that in their work. So like that, really like that. Room 3. So, okay, yeah, struggled to come up with novel idea. It really was just about situating practices as opposed to completely throwing the book out and starting again. This wasn't an etch-a-sketch activity. I call those etch-a-sketch. We go, do you know what? Forget everything you know. Let's start again. Well, no. Can you situate the work that you do now on this, and in what would you want to emphasize more of? Perhaps maybe even move some stuff around. Assessment is largely essay based, and there is an organizational resistance to change this. So that's an interesting comment, not unfamiliar. When were talking just now about the need perhaps for that countercultural movement, but I think this can be done if, again, shifting our mindset from task to practice. Can we and a process as well as a product or task focus, can we do some of these things more formatively, for example, and therefore maybe come up against a little bit less resistance, but keeping in mind that manageability and sustainability coin as well when we're deciding those things, so as not to create so much work that we can't get things done. So really, really interesting point there. Room 4, this is difficult. Of course it is. Anything worth doing is difficult. But again, coming back to the point, you've come at this cold, you've not had time to really spend any time with it, but it's all available to you over time. So please do dip in and out. We can work out if our assessments are student-led and or student-led, but struggling to clarify if it's more process or task. Again, that's an interesting observation. And I think that for me, that is a large part of why I wanted to present the work in the way it did, simply because it forces us to think in those terms. Okay, well, how do I do this? How do I lead this as a tutor, making it task focused or process focused? How do I allow students to take a little bit of ownership here in a task sense or a process sense? And having a sense of that on a practical level is going to be really useful to you, because it's actually only then you can really be intentional in that work. Portfolios are a good way. You could see how this would work more broadly if you overlaid a portfolio model onto this. So in a model, we're situating it in the context of a more authentic model of learning. So you might think in terms of, let's think about some of the allied health professions. Well, professional development, very often portfolio based. That's the kind of model of work we're going for. What are the key concepts of work here? How do I engage staff with that? What are the criteria for the assessment? How do I pull that through in terms of the portfolio? In terms of that more proximal frame and around meaning making, well, regular points of reflection, whether that be blogs or reflective artifacts or whatever, over time, does it have to be the tutor looking at that? Could it be the student? Again, more student led. And then ultimately, how do they package that up? Do they have a choice around how they present their portfolio, what they choose to pull through or not to represent and demonstrate learning aligned to the outcomes, again, being more student-led and process focused in terms of what they're doing now, but also what they want to do in the future. So again, portfolio really works for me in that space. And room 6 kind of picked up on something similar around creating portfolio responses. I'm going to have to go offline and contact you outside of that. I want to learn all about that now. Now you've mentioned that kind of Shakespeare to a Shakespeare text. Love that. So create artwork, film, all that. Again, AI throws a spanner in the works here in terms of how that's generated, but we were talking, Letty and I, just now about that, and I've got some kind of early thoughts on that. But this spanned the upper 2 frames, distal and situative, but we talked about the assessment moving through different frames as it evolved. Love that. And that's exactly what, so again, thinking of this, rather than having a task and situating certain tasks, think about how do we situate certain practices and what they're trying to do in the context of a broader assessment strategy or approach. Really, really, really useful. Right, okay. In the interest of time, and I understand we're not spending a great deal of time on that, but I love that. I love, I've only done this a handful of times in terms of offering this out to engage with from people outside of my very small kind of mentorship group, if you like, and critical friends. So this is one of the first opportunities I've had for, formative feedback, if you like. On that, being a culmination of the work that we've done and a way of trying to frame things that would be useful to others. So I really appreciate it. But I like the way that you're starting to think about working with the different frames, not as a series of steps, but as a framework for practice. And I think that for me is the key differentiating factor there. It's not intended as a checklist. All of these things can happen at the same time. So what is it that we do in a practice sense? So assessment as practice that allows that to happen. And I think that's the key difference. Really, 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 really great. I really appreciate that. Happy now, in the interest of inclusivity and transparency, to go back to my offer to come back to the questions. So we've got 20 minutes or so. I don't expect it will take up the full time, but I wanted to spend a bit more time with you and to do justice to the engagement you've you've applied to the session today and answer any questions you might have. So there's lots of questions. What I'm going to suggest is we'll take live questions now, and then please, if you feel that your question is maybe a loaded question, or maybe it's not quite formulated just now, you want to spend a bit more time with it, please pop that into the Q&A Padlet. What I'll do is I'm going to spend some time with all that and respond to each of those points in turn, and then we'll publish that Padlet next week sometime, and you'll be able to see all responses to all of those, as opposed to just piecemeal kind of bits and pieces. So hopefully that's more useful to you, and it's certainly more proactive for me, because it gives me an insight to where people are at, and I can engage with people more individually then. So I'm going to go into the chat just quickly, Letty, because
Sam, there are a couple of questions in there in the chat. There is one from Sophie. I don't know whether you want to pick that up now, and one from Charlie. I think they might be two to start us off with, and then we can take live questions.
Yeah, she's asked a great question around what's the difference between a process and a task. Of course, a task can be process based, and a process is a task in itself. The answer to that second question is no, because it's no longer a process. But you are doing something it's in the process of doing something. For me, the key difference is the opportunity to engage. So it's actually, over time for me. So in process terms, it's the opportunity to engage with something over time would differentiate that between a process and a task. So you can do a task and then, move on and not revisit that task. We want to situate those tasks, those practices within the process of learning, and therefore we do need to revisit, we need to reevaluate, we need to reflect on. And that's the key point. So it's over time. So time becomes a really key construct here. So, does it matter? Does it really matter in the context of your program assessment? Here's a question for you. Does it matter if you only do it once? When you say what matters most, if you're saying this really does matter, it matters now, but then you don't revisit that thing, that task, the work that you've done, and you don't revisit that, you don't reevaluate that work in light of new learning that students have done subsequently, does it really matter? Or are we just assuming that over time that students are building up these blocks of experience that they are naturally drawn upon? Well, maybe. But we need to be more intentional in that, in terms of teasing that learning out. So in terms of the differences between process and task, I would say, they would be the key differences. Charlie's got a question. Can I go to Charlie's question there? Charlie's my favourite name because it's my son's name. So that's who sat the SATs last week and the week before last and survived. Could you please give me an example of an assessment activity that sits within the distal frame? So the distal frame is the expression and an application of work. We've just talked about a great example there. So it could be the development of a creative artifact, say like a portfolio or an element of a portfolio. There's such a thing that's actually in the useful resources links in the resource that will be shared following the session around patchwork assessment. So if anybody's familiar with patchwork assessment or synoptic assessment, so you might be familiar with the term synoptic. So actually bringing different pieces of work together, practice together, and actually making sense of that in the context of a broader aim or objective. So that for me would be a great example of work in a distal frame. It says, okay, so we're bringing that all together. So in this frame, it's bringing that all together. It's allowing me to express things that mean something to me, demonstrate, yes, the learning outcomes and objectives, but also what I want to do or where I want to take this learning next. So being a more process focused. So that for me would be a good example and something that there's a link for and work to support in the resources to be shared. Letty, do you want to filter some of these out for me? So I'm just trying to. So Claire, good to see you, Claire. I'm going to come to Claire's comment actually. So that's another important aspect of practice approach, the idea of developing mastery, not just flitting about between assessments. This is exactly the point. So in terms of taking that process focus, the process focus is part of that mastering exercise. Again, do you master something doing it once? No. What are we mastering? So to go back to this, to the question that kind of framed that last task, what are we modeling for here? What are the kinds of learning we want to be demonstrated here? What are we modeling for with and for our students? Mastery is part of that, but what are they mastering? Yeah, to what end? Yeah, so that for me, having that, you need to be doing something, you know, there needs to be, in order to meet students where they are, there needs to be that task focus. We need to do something right there with them, you know, engaging those skills, meeting those challenges at that moment, yes, but also that needs to be situated within a broader process of learning development, understanding where they've been, where they're going to, and ultimately having a clear sense of what it is we're modeling for in terms of mastery. So Claire, really, really good point. Well made.
There is
Any
another,
other?
sorry,
go on,
Sam,
Letty.
there is another comment from Claire there that just before around sort of, you know, the danger sometimes of misusing some of those forms of assessment.
Yeah.
There's a comment around portfolios, and I think it leads to a really interesting point that we have mentioned around sort of over-assessment, which is something we all deal with. So
yeah, and I think over-assessment is something we can get into for sure. You know, we need another 4 hours, but because really, when you can think of, you know, you can have over-assessment, but really over-assessment is only realized at a course or program level, right? So, you know, it's an aggregation of work that creates that kind of experience of over-assessment. So when we're not thinking about, you know, what we're doing, how we're doing it, when we're doing assessment at a program level, you know, creating those red weeks, as I call them, you know, I've got 3 different pieces of assessment within 4 days of each other, and they're all very different. So the cognitive load is immense. You know, whereas if we'd thought about it up front and designed it, you know, with a program focused view in mind and understood how those different practices fitted together, then maybe the cognitive load would be less, you know, and maybe if one of those modules was using a portfolio and was then encouraging students to draw on the learning they were doing from other modules, for example, that aligned with the learning outcomes, maybe that would then provide a little bit of a less loaded kind of workload for students. But also thinking about things in terms of, well, okay, why are you using a portfolio? Yeah, what are we modeling for here? Is it just a convenient way of wrapping up your assessment and maybe hiding the fact that you're going to be doing loads of formative assessment? Well, firstly, if you're hiding formative assessment, you're doing it wrong. you know, never hide formative assessment. We're going to make this explicit, but ultimately, you know, thinking about that, if you're just applying a task focus to a portfolio approach, then we're missing out on all that process learning, process work that really is the ball game. So, you know, again, break it right down. Think about it. What are we modeling for here? What are we modeling for here? And then this idea of fit comes into it. Does the approach fit with what we're modeling for? And are there better approaches that fit better, for example, with that? Yeah, so that's where the frames are helpful, because, okay, if we're only operating really, if I'm spending all my time in the task focus frames, okay, does that go far enough? You know, so we do think about engaging students in the situated frame. Well, that's the hook for me. The hook, in order to hook students in, why does this matter? Why is it worthwhile? Well, this is the situation. This is why it's authentic to the kinds of things that you want to be doing, the kinds of learning that we think are important, but also you need to see play out. But also, you know, so what, now what becomes the proximal frame. So, okay, I've done that. So what have I learned? Where can I take that next? Yeah. So if we're not doing all of that together, we've only got that partial view. And I think that's really important. That's certainly come out, like I say, in terms of those frames, the learning that we've done. You know, we need to think about all of that together. You know, it's a package deal, very much so. But it's not a linear or prescriptive thing. Oh, I've ticked all the boxes. I do all of these things. How do they sit together? Thinking about the assemblages, or Tim Fawn's idea of the entangled work and practices that we do. You know, how does this all sit together? So we understand that, and we've got a sense of how that works. We can be more intentional in our practice. I think that's the ball game. Okay. Other questions, folks? And we have a few minutes. Talking of time, loads of people have got other meetings, which is absolutely understandable. But is there anybody that wants to stick their hand up? Have they got a burning question that you want to? And like I say, the opportunity is there to drop your question in the chat, should you formulate it a bit more fully in your minds after today. And I'll come at these over the next week or so, and we'll get a more fuller response. But we'll go with there. Letty, I don't know if you've got anything, or have you seen anything?
Absolutely. Well, I've got loads of thoughts and comments, but just I think, as you said, you know, we've it's been a very intense and sort of relatively long session. We haven't really given colleagues a break, and everyone is jumping into other meetings. But I'm so excited about all the different conversations that have been emerging in this process. So just really massive thanks to Sam to you know, to bring together those ideas and from those conversations around intentionality and flexibility, and obviously the idea of moving from task to practice, which is at the heart of the work that he's doing now, and also really just the way in which is modeled today, the idea of co-constructing knowledge in this space and gathering feedback from you. So really just to emphasize that point that Sam made around this being the start of an ongoing conversation. So we will follow up with the resources that Sam has shared. We'll make sure that there are opportunities to address the questions that you've raised both in the chat and on the Padlet, and we are going to share the recording of today's session, and also feel free to share it with colleagues more widely. I'm sure Sam is very happy to have
absolutely
to have feedback from other colleagues as well. And just massive thanks to Sam. This is really exciting, fantastic work that is incredibly timing at this particular point. So huge thanks.
Genuine pleasure. It's been great to work with you this morning.